All right, so this book review, unfortunately, was a book that I found somewhat disappointing. Um, it's called The Ideological Brain, The Radical Science of Flexible Thinking, and it's by Leor Zmigrod. I'm not really sure if I'm pronouncing her name properly, but um, obviously it's about ideology. And, I read it because I've just been interested in political thinking and ideologies recently, and so I've just been trying to learn more about it and kind of the roots of those, the origins of how we think, and how that works. Now, the reason I say it was somewhat disappointing is because it wasn't quite what I was hoping for. It didn't have as much as I was hoping for, and it wasn't really the same type of read as a couple of recent texts that I've read. It was good. I would say it's probably a 6 out of 10, and so here are my reasons. So the lower score is largely because of the style of the book. I think the author was trying to be very creative and tried a few things that were, somewhat flourishy in the descriptions, and this kind of amounted to, for lack of a better term, a lot of fluff, I would say. There was just kind of a lot of rhetorical discussion about ideology and not quite as much of just kind of like the scientific evidence. And there was that throughout, and those things were interesting. But I think, just this style of writing was in some ways just kind of the wrong place to do it, with a book about kind of the scientific basis for political thinking. It didn't really seem like, it wasn't really necessary, at least for me. I was really hoping more just for some direct information about some of the research that has been done and how that affects, the way things work today. And so it might have been just a product of this type of writing that the author was trying to execute. But overall, I feel like part of the problem was that a lot of the points and the discussions about studies and things, it wasn't very clear what was being supported, what sort of arguments were being supported, and how these things were relevant to the point of the book. This kind of emerged, the general argument of the book really emerged a lot more at the very end. But I would say some positive points about the book were, so the main idea basically was, what is sort of the biological basis for ideological thinking? Or is there sort of a biological basis for this? And ultimately, the general answer is partially yes. And so this is really interesting to see how our biological genetics actually are a factor in and play a role in how some of us are more predisposed to ideological thinking. And it's important to note this term, ideology or ideological thinking. The author discusses kind of the history of it and describes the definition here is really more of a way of radical or dogmatic thinking. And so ideology, or an ideologue, is something or somebody who thinks in these very rigid ways. And that term rigid is very intentional as well. This was an interesting part of the book. Basically, the discussion about all of this is that we are genetically predisposed to either being able to think rigidly or flexibly. And this is really largely what determines whether someone is an ideological thinker. And if you're like me, maybe you were thinking this is kind of speaking to whether somebody is more kind of directed towards the conservative or the liberal end of the political spectrum, but that's not quite right. It's actually more of whether or not you are a radical thinker in either direction. So someone who thinks ideologically is someone who thinks very radically or dogmatically on the conservative side, or somebody who thinks radically or dogmatically on the liberal side. And again, as I've said in the past, we don't want to just diminish this discussion to this sort of binary, and it also shouldn't just be focused on politics. It also has to do with religion and other things as well. But the point being, whether or not we're a rigid or a flexible sort of person, or whether or not our minds are rigid or flexible, this basically means, it refers to how we respond to our environment, in particular change or new information and things like this. And so it tends to be that a person that has this proclivity, this genetic proclivity towards rigidity in their thinking, they tend to become more dogmatic and ideological, whereas somebody who has this more flexible way of perceiving the world and responding to the world, they tend to be more moderate and much less dogmatic about the way that they think. And so just to clarify, again, this term ideology, although it's not stated explicitly by the author, by the end of it, you really get the sense that the author is clearly seeing this term as a negative thing. So essentially, an ideology is bad, and ideological thinking is bad. And that's because of this excessive rigidity that prevents us from being able to interact with the world in a more reasonable and factually based way. So yeah, overall, the book was good. It felt like a lot for really only saying a couple of basic things. One, the idea of an ideology is specifically something that is more radical. And two, we actually are genetically predisposed to this sort of rigid thinking. And so by the end of the text, the author is talking about the ways that we can maybe not just live our lives, but make political decisions and enact change and have effective systems without having to think in this sort of rigid, dogmatic way. Now, I think your response to this text will largely depend on whether or not you agree with the author's definition of ideology. And again, she did support her definition with various ideas throughout history, the origins of the term and how it's been used and how it's been studied. But I think there is an argument to be made that an ideology isn't necessarily just a radical way of thinking. It is something that everybody has. Everybody has an ideology. I think that's probably the way that most people think of the term. So, as with other texts, this is a way that the author has sort of not redefined disingenuously, but is helping us to understand a true definition of this term. And so there's that, whether or not you agree with that understanding of the term. But then there's also whether or not you think that thinking radically is a good or a bad thing. And I think the author is fairly successful in showing that this sort of radical dogmatic thinking is more of a negative than a positive. It can be more detrimental than beneficial. And so I think with that in mind, the conclusions were relatively reasonable. So for myself, reflecting on the text, a couple of things that come to mind are, one, it really just made me feel like, there are ways that we can actively choose to be more flexible. Once we're aware of these ideas, we can prevent ourselves from, being too rigid in our thinking. And I think this was largely the goal, or a goal of the author, to kind of get people to see that, we don't have to be trapped in sort of a rigid way of living our lives. And this was a big part of the discussion as well, whether there's free will or determinism in how our genes predispose us, and how that affects our lives. And so overall, the author kind of just leaves us with this question about whether or not ideological or radical thinking is totally necessary or helpful, and are there ways that we can actively be more flexible in how we make decisions or the beliefs that we have. And I would say this is a really good question to keep in mind as we navigate any sort of sphere, in particular political or religious spheres.